Hello, everyone. Welcome to Learning Inside Out, the fourth panel in the Art Schools of Asia Symposium. I am Sooyoung, Research Associate at Asia Art Archive. Starting in the fall of 2021, the Art Schools of Asia Symposium culminates a monthly seminar series with a cohort of 18 emerging scholars from around the world. The seminars took us on a journey across time and geography, from Shantiniketan, founded in the early 20th century as a school for the arts with both local and international aspirations, to China and Tibet in the era of training in socialist realist painting, to Yogyakarta and Bandung, the sites of the first post-colonial schools in Indonesia, to Lahore, home of the Mayo School of Arts, which became the National College of Arts in the new nation of Pakistan, to the Istanbul Academy of Fine Arts, where the reform of the curriculum coincided with the student movement of 1968, and to Hanoi, where the introduction of conceptual and performance-based practices was part and parcel of the Doi Moi moment in Vietnam. In revisiting these sites, the Art Schools of Asia program sought to highlight the often under-recognized role played by such sites of teaching and learning to the development of modern and contemporary art across the region and beyond, but also to decenter art history and scholarship away from Euro-American paradigms. The Symposium of Art Schools of Asia is divided into 6 sessions, and we already have had the first 3 sessions during last week. So as a whole, the symposium will provide the opportunity for a larger public to take part in these discussions with the participants of the seminars and with a number of esteemed and invited guest scholars. Together, the panels and discussions consider topics such as the relation of schools to the nation states, the development of media such as prints, the connection to artistic institutions and associations, and the place of experimentation. And before I introduce our panelists today, I would like to acknowledge the contribution of our peers at AAA, Susanna Chong, Oscar Ursoy, Rebecca To, and Carol Choi in the programs department, Paul Femin, Karen Chung, and Chelsea Ma in editorial, Crystal Lee, Ruby Weatherall, and Haley Wu in development, Sally Lee and Chris Hall, Clare Xu, and Jane de Beauvoir, who understood the importance of the project, and most especially Leah Lam, who has been handling the administration for the project and keeping the seminar running as smoothly as it has been, and who is now with Rebecca and Carol running the symposium at the background. Last but not least, we would like to thank the Getty Foundation, without whose support and vision for the Connecting Art Histories initiative, this project would not have been possible. So the theme of today's panel is Learning Inside Out. While art schools are considered to be the most significant sites for education, the learning of art could also happen beyond the walls of art schools, expanding and diffusing into various other institutions and social spaces. So our speakers today will investigate sites such as the Sogetsu Ikebana School, a flower arrangement school founded in post-war Japan, and the various foreign culture centers in post-war Korea, and the mural paintings in the pagodas in the rural areas of modern Cambodia. Together, they lead us to think about how the teaching and learning in these spaces complement, challenge, or function as alternatives to the pedagogies within formal art schools. And today's panel will begin with the presentations by 3 scholars from Art Schools of Asia cohort, Alice Ashiwa, Sooyoung Leam, and Vera May, and which will be followed by a Q&A session. And to our audience online, you are encouraged to type your questions in the Q&A box anytime throughout the panel. So our first speaker today, Alice Ashiwa, is a doctoral candidate in the history department at University of California, Los Angeles, and a Japan Foundation Research Fellow. She also works as a translator and independent curator in the United States and Japan. Her dissertation focuses on avant-garde art movements in the social political context of Japan during the first 3 decades after World War II, and more specifically, looks at how institutional and patronage support in the art scene paradoxically harbored and hindered the artistic practices for different generations of artists. And our second speaker, Sooyoung Leam, is a curator and art historian working between Seoul and London. Her ongoing research on archives explores intersections between sculpture, performance, and politics in Asia. She studied history of art at Cambridge University and completed her PhD at the Cohort Institute of Art on Leam Tech, the making and unmaking of sculpture in contemporary Korean art. Her recent curatorial projects include Art Reimagined, organized by Meta in Seoul in 2022, and actually The Dead Are Not Dead in Seoul in 2021. Her essays have appeared in the Sculpture Journal and Journal of History of Modern Art, among others. And she is currently assistant curator of the 14th Gwangju Biennale in 2023. And our third speaker today, Vera May, is a PhD candidate in the history of art and archaeology at the School of Oriental and African Studies, University of London, where she is researching regional tendencies of Southeast Asian art during the Cold War eras in Cambodia, Indonesia, and Singapore. Before this, she spent several years working as a contemporary art curator at St. Paul Street Gallery at Auckland University of Technology in New Zealand, and the Nanyang Technological University Center for Contemporary Art in Singapore, among other venues. She is also co-founding editor of the peer-reviewed journal, Southeast of Now, Directions in Contemporary and Modern Art in Asia. And the second half of the panel today there will be a presentation and conversation by our two guest speakers, Professor Tsewang Tashi from Tibet University and Professor Clare from the University of Oxford, who are both experts in Tibetan modern and contemporary art, and I will introduce more about them later. We will also have a discussion session after their conversation. So now, without further ado, I hand things over to Alice.
Thank you, Sooyoung, for that introduction. Thank you, everyone, for joining us this evening, my time. And also, thank you to the AAA team for this opportunity to present here today and the brilliant seminar that you have been putting on for us for the last 10 months. Okay, so let me share my screen now. Okay, is everyone seeing this? Yes? Okay. Formation and transformation of post-World War II avant-garde art through the Sogetsu Art Center. From its inception in 1958, the Sogetsu Art Center quickly became a prominent hub of avant-garde art activities in Tokyo. As one of the few places that supported the avant-garde art at the time, it helped create many influential works encompassing music, film, theater, dance, and other performances such as happenings. It also invited many prominent American and European artists, arguably becoming the most culturally international space in Japan at the time. The art center was so successful because it was backed by a flower arrangement school called the Sogetsu Ikebana School that predated the art center. And just for clarification, Ikebana means flower arrangement in Japanese, and I will be using this term Ikebana throughout my presentation today. For this symposium, I would like to focus on the Ikebana school as indicated by the supplemental title here in pink. I will discuss how the Sogetsu Ikebana school transformed the traditional art form through the value of individualism associated with modernism and commercialization. I do so by first introducing the school's founder, Teshigahara Sofu, to understand the ideas behind the school. Then I will focus on the school's operational structure and pedagogy. Sofu was born in 1900 as the first son of a famous Ikebana master. Expected to follow in his father's footsteps, he studied Ikebana and various other traditional art forms from a young age. Growing up during a liberal and westernizing period in early 20th century Japan, he was also exposed to European modernist art movements. This exposure influenced Sofu to develop a revolutionary ikebana style that drew inspiration from modern art. The image here on the right is an example of a traditional flower arrangement. It uses live flowers and plants and is arranged in one of the several predetermined shapes. On the left is an example of Sofu's ikebana. As you can see, his ikebana uses unconventional materials like dead plants and metal, and the shape also completely breaks away from any predetermined ones. Instead, his ikebana is reminiscent of a surrealist sculpture or a Duchampian ready-made. Sofu also ventured into various other art forms, such as painting, sculpture, photography, and even set design. His prominence as an artist grew in the late 1950s when he was recognized by the French critic Michel Tapier as one of the Japanese artists practicing gestural abstraction or art informel. After this, Sofu was regularly invited to international exhibitions such as the Venice Biennale and Triennale Milano. He also had many solo exhibitions at prominent museums and galleries in Japan and abroad. The image here is a page from a journal article featuring Sofu's solo exhibition at Martha Jackson Gallery in New York from 1959. As you can see from the photos of the exhibition, Sofu often exhibited his sculptures and abstract paintings together with ikebana works. This demonstrates how Sofu considered the two genres, fine art and ikebana, under one discursive category, which was revolutionary for the ikebana world. Here is an image of Sofu's sculpture. It's displayed in front of Fernand Léger's painting to the right. This clearly shows that Sofu positioned his work in relation to Western modernism. Art critics often compared him to prominent Western artists such as Pablo Picasso and Jackson Pollock. Sofu was prolific in both the number of works and the variety of modernist styles that he worked in. He often explained that his diverse artistic works resulted from simply, freely pursuing whatever he felt at the moment without premeditative outcomes. Like a true modernist, he valued individuality and self-expression. Next, I would like to turn our attention to Sofu's ikebana school. Sofu founded the Sogetsu Ikebana School in 1928 to teach his radical ikebana style. Although the school steadily gained students in the 1930s, World War II halted its development. When it resumed again in the late 1940s, its popularity skyrocketed. Like many other schools of traditional art forms, the Sogetsu Ikebana School operated under a system of licensing the teaching called the Iemoto system. This centuries-old system gives the master of the school, called Iemoto in Japanese, the exclusive power to confer licenses and give permission to use his technique. Those who obtain the licenses are allowed to teach the technique of the master. This system ensures the continuity of the master's, and namely the school's style. However, the authority of the master is transmitted to only one person, usually to the son. In the post-war years, ikebana schools, including Sogetsu, further standardized and bureaucratized this Iemoto system. Nancy Stalker has stated that the post-war ikebana schools operated like a non-profit enterprise. Here is a chart of how the Iemoto system looked at Sogetsu in 1957. As you can see, Sofu, who was the master, was at the top. Below him were several thousand teachers, and then below them were approximately 500,000 students. Students could rise through levels and eventually become teachers if they wanted to. Moving up the levels entailed paying a monthly membership fee and attending classes, which were usually held several times a month. Students also had to purchase the textbooks and flower arrangement equipment from the school. After completing the textbook for a particular level, a student could advance to the next level by paying another fee. It took a minimum of 2 years to reach level 1. The Sogetsu teachers received 40% of the money, and the rest went to Sofu. Through this system, the Sogetsu Ikebana School became a wealthy and powerful institution with teacher-ran classrooms all over Japan and even abroad. Many members were middle-class women. Since the mid-19th century, when Japan began modernizing, Ikebana was promoted as a desirable skill set for women to cultivate their expected roles as wives and mothers. In addition, the Iemoto system in the post-war years provided hundreds of thousands of women independent income as licensed Ikebana teachers. And this issue of gender is very interesting, but unfortunately, I don't have time to discuss it further here. Among the many Ikebana schools at the time, the Sogetsu Ikebana School was particularly popular because its pedagogy emphasized individual creativity. This was liberating compared to the conventional Ikebana schools in which students were taught to replicate the teacher's arrangement. At the Sogetsu Ikebana School, students were first taught standardized flower arrangement rules and shapes. But once they mastered these shapes, they were allowed to practice what the school called freestyle. Instead of following the traditional rules of Ikebana, the motto of the Sogetsu school was, quote, Ikebana that anyone can enjoy anytime, anywhere, using any material, end quote. This made the typically exclusive art form very accessible. Sofu explained his pedagogy. Quote, learning Ikebana is like drawing. For example, you give a student a piece of paper and ask them to draw a circle, but you don't instruct them where to draw the circle on the paper. This is the same as asking a student to place a flower in a vase to make some kind of shape. The school was supposed to be a place that provided students with the necessary tools to express their individuality. Sofu believed that a wide range of experiences was part of such tools that the school had to offer. This reflects the influence of the Bauhaus ethos that emphasized learning by doing and research. The school provided experiences to the students by spending millions of yen to host elaborate exhibitions, workshops, and other educational programs. By paying a fee to partake in these events, the students were exposed to various art forms. One of the largest exhibitions was the annual Sogetsu School exhibition, in which members were encouraged to exhibit their works. Sofu believed that exhibiting together would heighten the students' sense of individuality, as they had to be original for their works to stand out. Sofu and other Sogetsu teachers served as juries to give awards at these exhibitions. And the best works got featured in the Sogetsu School's journal. The Sogetsu School's journal, published several times a year, also served as an important educational platform. The pages were filled with photographs of prominent traditional and modern artworks, articles by art critics, and Sofu's photos and comments from his travels abroad. In 1958, the school began an educational program called the Sogetsu Cultural Education Club. The club's aim was to provide an art historical education so that the students could better appreciate various forms of art. The students paid a monthly fee to attend the club's events. These events often involved a screening of a film or a performance, which was then followed by lectures on how to interpret the work. An article in the Sogetsu journal advertising the club read, quote, "You must expand your studies in various directions, such as film, music, theater, and entertainment. The Sogetsu Cultural Education Club will have an unparalleled direct impact on our creative endeavors." At this point in the late 1950s, the Sogetsu Ikebana School was clearly developing into an institution beyond the school of a traditional art form. It had repositioned Ikebana in the framework of fine art, particularly that of Western modern art, and successfully commercialized it. The Iemoto system ensured that this culture Sogetsu offered was endlessly commodifying and expanding. By simply paying the monthly membership fee, anybody could now partake in the modern arts through Sogetsu. In the late 1950s was also when the Ikebana School began to patronize more experimental and underground art activities by establishing the Sogetsu Art Center. Sofu encouraged his Ikebana students to attend the art center's experimental events held in the basement hall of the Ikebana School. The Ikebana students, who were mostly women, as mentioned before, excitedly attended these avant-garde art events. My larger dissertation project explores the overlaps and tensions between the Ikebana School and the Art Center. As I have presented, the Ikebana School commercialized a traditional art form through modernism. The Art Center produced works that challenged this very commercialization of art, as well as the values of modernism and tradition. So there was obviously a developing tension between the Ikebana School and the Art Center. This tension escalated in the late 1960s as part of the global 1960s moment of liberation, activism, and protest against the establishment. In 1968 and 69, a younger generation of artists conducted protests against the Art Center, eventually leading to its closure in 1971. However, the Sogetsu Ikebana School continues to this day and now is headed by Sofu's granddaughter. So I hope my presentation raised some shared themes and questions that we can discuss about more later. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Alice. And now we will invite Sooyoung to give her presentation.
Before I begin, I'd like to thank the AAA team for organizing and running this program for the past 10 months. It's been a great privilege also to listen to the wonderful presentations from the symposium. And to make the most out of 15 minutes I have, my presentation will be organized in two parts. First, I'll introduce an overview of post-Korean War art education in South Korea, focusing on sculpture and the rivalry between two art schools, namely Hongik University and Seoul National University. This partly stems from my PhD research. And the second part will entail the research interest I've developed while taking part in the Art Schools of Asia program, which considers foreign culture centers as important sites of art education and more specifically self-learning that complements official academic education. If you could, yeah, thank you. So my PhD examined the making and unmaking of sculpture in contemporary Korean art through the works and writings of Lee Seung-taek, whose category-defying practice extends from the post-war period to the present day. Born in 1932 in Gowon, nowadays North Korea, Lee fled to South Korea just after the Korean War broke out in 1950 with his family and settled in Seoul and subsequently enrolled at Hongik University's sculpture department. Although Lee has been predominantly discussed within the history of Korean avant-garde performance art, as a formerly trained sculptor, I tried to unpack the complex ways in which he both worked with and against the shifting notions of sculpture throughout the second half of the 20th century. Next. As one of the first college-level art schools founded in Korea in the late 1940s, Hongik University had become one of the leading official art schools in Korea, along with the Seoul National University, in a matter of few years. They played a pivotal role in developing a first generation of classically trained sculptors and shaping the course of the post-war art scene. Their academic rivalries and confrontations naturally formed two opposing pillars in the Korean art world. Hongdaepa, and Pa here in Korean means clan or group, represented by the teachers and graduates of Hongik University, typically associated themselves with the avant-garde, underground, experimental, and abstract art, while Midaepa, represented by the teachers and graduates of Seoul National University, identified themselves with conservative academicism and realism. The dichotomy, however, was less a result of profound pedagogical differences, but more a reflection of individual personality and contrasting educational background of the founders of each school. Considering the concentration of power and prestige the two figures assumed in the period of uncertainty and the lack of specialists in the profession, it's not surprising to find that their value systems, leadership styles, and personalities had a visible impact in the academic arena. Known as a quiet and restrained figure, Chang Bal, who founded the Fine Arts College at Seoul National University, was educated in the US, where he studied art at Columbia University. Although the fine art program at both universities were modeled on Japanese curriculum, Chang also promoted American educational system. Art students at Seoul National University were obliged to take introduction courses to philosophy, literature, art theory, anatomy, along with their practical classes, being trained as so-called artist intellectuals. Particularly within sculpture, there was a greater emphasis on perfecting a technique and faithful depictions of human figures based on close observations and anatomical studies. Individual expressions or radical experiments with materials were discouraged, if not strictly regulated. Next, please. On the contrary, students at Hongik University were given relatively more freedom to experiment with different methods and materials. Yoon Hyo-jung, who established the Fine Art College at Hongik University, was particularly known for his decadent personality. Together with Kim Kyung-seung, who also taught at the school, Yoon studied sculpture at Tokyo School of Fine Arts in the early 1940s. In Japan, the so-called Western-style sculpture was already introduced to the college curriculum by the 1890s, and artists such as Takamura Kotaro or Shimizu Takashi, who had personally interacted or studied with modern European sculptors, were teaching there. Having been indirectly introduced to European abstract art in Japan, Yoon eagerly promoted abstraction when he returned back home. Next, please. And it's also important to note that contrasting approaches to art education had a far-reaching effect, which extended beyond the realm of the art school. Numerous artist collectives that emerged throughout the 1960s, for instance, were largely grouped according to academic affiliations. The fact that master-pupil relationship was an integral part of art education further perpetuated binary mechanisms of the art world throughout the post-war years. Personal networks centered around a handful of teachers in academia played an important role when it came to art competitions and even Gukjeon, the national art exhibition, which was one of the few platforms artists could exhibit at the time. Often assuming the position of jury members, the senior academic staffs asserted extensive power over the formation of the art world in general. Next, please. Within the field of sculpture, master-pupil network was further enforced by public monument commissions. Typically, figures like Kim Kyung-seung would monopolize state commissions on large-scale bronze statues and mobilize select students for production, as seen in this picture. To the right, you see Kim Kyung-seung overseeing his students working on the statue of General Douglas MacArthur. In comparison to painters, sculptors working in post-war Korea faced many limitations. To begin with, there was a significant lack of sculptural materials and resources. Due to the volume and weight of sculptures, exhibitions dedicated to the genre were scarce, and international exhibitions organized by foreign embassies, for instance, were almost exclusively limited to paintings, photographs, and prints. When materials and resources were limited, print publications became the primary means of accessing knowledge and information about Western art for both students and teachers of art schools. The impact such publications would have on a generation of sculptors can be demonstrated by Yoon Hyo-jung's visit to Europe in 1952. Next slide, please. In September 1952, by when the Korean War had reached a stagnant phase, Yoon was invited to participate the International Conference of Artists in Venice, organized by UNESCO, as one of the 5 delegates from Korea. There, Yoon attended sessions specially organized for sculptors, at which Henry Moore was invited as a keynote speaker. Having met some of the leading sculptors of the time, Yoon is known to have spent 2 months in Europe collecting a huge compilation of catalogs on artists such as Marino Marini, Barbara Hepworth, and Hans Arp. Upon returning, he shared them with his students at Hongik University, who later claimed the importance of learning sculpture abstraction from their rare encounters with heavily illustrated catalogs. Here you see sketches by Lee Seung-taek made after Henry Moore's works, detailing their distinctive material properties, volumes, and shapes. Next slide, please. One before that? Yes, thank you. And this brings me to the second part of my presentation. Equipped with libraries, exhibition space, screening rooms, and other public facilities, foreign cultural centers across the South Korean peninsula performed a pivotal role, enhancing the cultural and intellectual life of the Korean citizens. Following the opening of the United States Office of Civil Information in 1947, over 40 cultural centers are known to have opened with the help of the United States Information Service across the South Korean peninsula in the 1950s. Establishing a keen affiliation with local communities in cities such as Busan, Daegu, and Gwangju, the culture centers particularly emphasize their public and cultural value. Next, please. Despite their inherently political nationalistic agenda, their identification as non-political organizations enabled the steady dissemination of culture and information regardless of shifting political and diplomatic conditions of the nation. Beginning with the establishment of the culture centers affiliated to the USIS, French Culture Center opened to the public in 1968, followed by the Goethe Institute in 72, and the British Council in 73. And they served as key outlets through which Korean artists accessed recent developments in contemporary art. The USIS's main library in the Seoul office held an impressive collection of over 28,000 titles by 1971, including over 150 academic journals. Although relatively smaller in size, the public libraries run by the British Council and French Culture Center similarly offered a wide range of film, visual art, and book programs. Annual and management reports produced by the British Council, you see here, offers a greater insight into how such cultural centers were already in operation before the opening of an official center, and how their programs were closely monitored in relation to the nation's changing socio-political landscape. Next, please. Artists, including sculptors, stayed up to date with international discourses and practices primarily through the American and European periodicals and popular magazines. One of the less frequently mentioned but equally significant periodicals was Career, published by the UNESCO. Established with the objective of building, quote, building peace by disseminating knowledge and cultures, unquote. Career was one of the rare periodicals authorized to cross the Iron Curtain at the height of the Cold War tensions, asserting a far greater visibility and circulation than Life magazine, for instance. From interviews conducted with surviving post-war generation of artists in Korea as part of public institutions' ongoing oral history projects, we're now able to better understand the degree of impact such cultural centers had on Korean artists and art education in general. But I also acknowledge the need to supplement that with greater archival research. Next, please. What fascinates me also is that these culture centers not only act as complementary sites for official art education, to the official art education at degree issuing universities, but as contested sites of democracy, and I like to argue of unlearning. In the 1980s, for instance, Koreans increasingly came to question the US role in Korea's quest for democracy. And one of the ways of demonstrating that dissatisfaction and resistance was the attack on American cultural centers. The burnings and occupations of the center's libraries that took place in different cities throughout the course of the nation's drive towards democratization were obviously not unique to Korea. Already in the 1960s, similar instances occurred throughout Southeast Asia. Considering such resonances and the pivotal role culture centers played as both diplomatic and educational platforms across Asia throughout the Cold War, I hope to expand the geopolitical scope of my research to explore possible connections and parallels that could be drawn across this network of centers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sooyoung. And we will now have the first round of discussion. And so while we wait for more questions from the audience, I would like to ask a few questions for the speakers first. So for Alice and Vera, and one observation I had in your presentations is that the spaces of art education you focus on had kind of enabled the art practices that do not easily fit into the existing categories of art. And perhaps these discoveries of these art practices are some of the most delighting things that when we investigate the outcomes of art education beyond the formal art schools. So my questions to both Alice and Vera are related to the challenge to categories and definition. So Alice, since your topic is about the formation and transformation of avant-garde art through the Sogetsu Art Center, so my question is, were the ikebana works that Sofu and his students created considered as a kind of avant-garde art practice in Japan or among the international audiences at the time? And if they were, how did they enrich or complicate the definition of avant-garde art? And if they were not, what do you think are the reasons of their exclusion? And I also have a question for Sooyoung, and I will ask it first so that each of you could have some time to think about the questions. Sooyoung, could you tell us more about the methodology while you were researching the learning that happened in these foreign cultural centers? Because I think the learning that took place in these cultural centers are more flexible and more unsystematic and with perhaps less obligations when compared to what people do in the art schools. And people may have more freedom to choose whatever resources they are interested in. And even if they are exposed to the same books or films, or maybe they participated in the same events, they may have very different attitudes and do not necessarily assimilate the influences they received into their own practices in the same way. So maybe sometimes it can be very challenging for the art historians to really delineate the genealogies of knowledge that were generated in these sites of informal learning, or to articulate the impact that these spaces had made on certain individuals or art groups, or on the formation of a specific artistic or political movement. So maybe could you share some of your experiences regarding this question during your research? Yeah. So may I ask Alice to answer the question?
Sure, yeah, thank you so much for that question. I mean, avant-garde art is a very broad category. And I think your question about was the Sogetsu Ikebana considered avant-garde art? The answer depends on who you asked at the time. I think if you asked, if you asked the Ikebana art world, the answer would have been yes. His Ikebana was called Zen-e Ikebana, which means avant-garde Ikebana within the Ikebana art world. And there was even questioning within the Ikebana art world about his Sogetsu's Ikebana, if that can be considered Ikebana because it's too avant-garde, too close to modernism or modern fine art. So the definition of avant-garde art within the Ikebana world was based on the Ikebana's proximity to modern art. And then if you asked the avant-garde artists at the time, so 50s and 60s, and many of these artists were involved with the Sogetsu Art Center, and they were making, a lot of them are making like contemporary sound, jazz, and a lot of performance happenings in experimental theater. And these artists would have said that the Sogetsu Ikebana was different from their category of avant-garde art, because the Ikebana was actually not really classified as art within the general bigger art world. And that was exactly what Teshigara Sofu was trying to challenge. But, you know, these avant-garde artists definitely separated their avant-garde art activities from Ikebana's, any Ikebana, even Sogetsu's kind of modernized Ikebana, because it was a part of this Iemoto system that I talked about, because it was tied with a very different institutional system than art world. And then if you asked the international audience, by international, I mean mostly like Western and American, European audience, and particularly the avant-garde art crowd in that era, they would have probably said given more of a yes, it was avant-garde art, because actually a lot of them, like famous name would be like John Cage, for example, was heavily actually influenced by Sogetsu's avant-garde art or avant-garde Ikebana. And he actually visited the art center many times. And he visited the art center not exactly to interact with the other avant-garde artists who were part of the Sogetsu Art Center, but John Cage visited to interact actually with Sofu Teshigara and his Ikebana activities, because from his perspective, it represented Zen art, Zen culture, and it was within the Ikebana world, because Sogetsu's Ikebana was close to modern art. For John Cage, it was a very digestible, accessible form of what he thought was Japanese Zen culture. So, I mean, that's kind of, I answered from 3 different perspectives. But yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. That's super interesting. And Sooyoung, could you please answer the question? Okay.
Yeah, thank you, Congyang, for that insightful question. Because this is very much research in progress, methodology is certainly something that I am thinking about as I go along and develop my research. And so far, a lot of this sort of discourse and existing study on the role of culture centers were sort of done through oral history projects, as I mentioned in my presentation. And museums, for instance, the Leam Museum conducted this sort of oral research project with surviving sculptors, post-war sculptors. And this was very helpful in sort of laying out or like mapping out how influential those culture centers were to those artists, young emerging artists, at a time when resources were so scarce, and how often then these culture centers were like sites of self-learning. So this oral history is very important. It sort of lays an important ground, but I would like to introduce sort of like the archival research to that as an important sort of methodological approach. And so one of the archive research I've conducted was the documents that were produced by the British Council in Korea. And through these documents, I was able to find that not only did they record the kind of resources like the books, the films that they were producing or importing through Japan, they were also closely monitoring like the visitor experience. So to some extent, we can glean from this kind of managing and operation reports how these materials were being utilized by the public, and to a certain extent, some of the artists. This is very sort of cursory, but I think more research into the sort of culture documents produced by culture centers would be very helpful and enlightening in many ways to kind of really map out how the information information flow through these different institutions. And also, more importantly, they closely developed programs, education programs with universities as well. So they had a direct impact on university art education, for instance. Yet this is the part that hasn't been really discussed so far. So it's really like the primary research that I think forms an important aspect of like my methodological approach, if you would say so. Yeah, so far it's very much a work in progress.
Thank you, Sooyoung. And perhaps Professor Clare Harris and Tsewang Tashi, would you have some responses and questions for the panelists?
Thank you very much.
In fact, I'll just mention very briefly, I think the sort of thing that Tsewang is thinking about is a painting, in fact, by Amdo Chamba that is in Lhasa, in one of the major buildings belonging to the buildings of the Dalai Lamas. And that contains a very similar kind of thing, which is a fusion actually of some very kind of traditional elements of painting, and then a kind of hyperrealism that definitely has a photographic source to portray visiting dignitaries or significant individuals who needed to be kind of alluded to by the patrons of that building. So what I wanted to ask you is, can we start, if we start to look at things like that, at the phenomena in Cambodia and in somewhere like Tibet, in a kind of another Buddhist context? You mentioned Buddhist socialism. I'm really interested in Buddhist socialist realism, which is definitely one of the things that's going on amongst some of the artists in Tibet in the kind of 60s and 70s. Anyway, but I know other people have got questions in the background there from the audience. So maybe I could just put a kind of wider question that several of you might want to come back on, but it particularly arises out of Alice's presentation. And by the way, thank you to everybody for such great presentations, really interesting. I just thought on one level, I had a very practical question for you, Alice, about Sofu and about how did he train? How come he became this kind of, in a way, this revolutionary and kind of rethinking Ikebana, since the theme of this conference is about education and how people come up with their ideas as artists and even as art teachers. How did he become so a kind of avant-garde? And then my question is more generally about, I mean, it seems that the school that he created was a kind of deep irony, really. I kept noting down when you were talking about, individualism and kind of the relationship between individualism and modernism and things like that. And yet this was in a kind of context of the mass, of very large numbers of people. So I was kind of also going back to those old chestnuts in art history and in anthropology and in many other disciplines, between the traditional and the modern/modernist, the notion of the kind of mass, the collective, versus the individual and the kind of hyper-individualism of artists. And I was just thinking, your case study there is just such a kind of classic way of crossing over between the two, really, isn't it? In the sense that it seems that the Ikebana school, taught people to kind of be individualist. So they felt they were having that kind of glimpse of being, being an artist and having individualism, and yet they were all incredibly regimented. So that whole concept as well that I think Vera was alluding to too, about the idea of, is art education about obedience and kind of training and control in a kind of Foucauldian sense, or is it also where do we see the points at which it becomes a place for kind of experimentation and deviation? I mean, I think, to push it a little bit hard, and you probably won't agree, Alice, the Ikebana school is almost like a kind of, you use these sort of terms yourself, it's a kind of commodification of the idea of the individualism of the artist, the originality of the artist, that is for the consumption of large numbers of people, and particularly women. So I don't know if there's a question in there, but there may be some ideas that any one of you might like to come back to me on. I mean, I think for all of us as art historians, those kind of tensions between the traditional and the modern, the modernist, as they play out in the way that artists are trained. I mean, that all came through in all of your talks in interesting ways.
And thank you, Claire. And actually, we have some questions from the audience. One question is for Alice. What did the space of the Sogetsu art school look like? I'm curious, since it seems there were so many teachers and students there.
Okay, yeah, maybe I just to comment on what Professor Harris said about this individualism en masse. I will comment on that briefly first and then answer this question. So yeah, this tension between, actually it's not a, opposite, it's together, right? This individualism and then this massification. And it's very much, Sofu's individualism is actually within his framework of what he thinks is freedom, what his version, he creates, the Iemoto system, makes sure that his style perpetuates down the chain. When you look at actually the magazine of the school, the students are making variety of kinds of ikebana, but it's all within Sofu's boundaries, within the school's boundaries. But then I think there's also an interesting aspect when you consider gender here, because most of the students were women, and not many of them were able to get education in a regular art school or university setting. So in a way, for them, this was also a way to pursue their kind of creative freedom, and in a kind of within the acceptable framework. So compared to other ikebana schools, Sofu's school did provide women a lot more freedom. So it's kind of talking about freedom within bounds. And then I think we can also think about this with some of the other presentations that were mentioned too, of this like even internationalism within bounds of nation too. So it's very much kind of these two tensions of ideas, but they're actually, kind of layered together. And then to answer the question about the space of the Sogetsu Art Center and the Ikebana School, thank you so much for asking this question. This is actually a pretty big part of my dissertation. I just didn't have time to talk about it today. But the school, so the art center was located in the basement of the school, and the school was located in a very wealthy neighborhood in Tokyo, and actually sandwiched between embassies. And the architecture of the school, it was built in 1958 when the art center was also founded. And the architecture, it was designed by a very prominent architect who'd also designed a lot of government buildings in the 40s and 50s. And the building won awards for being kind of this combination of a Japanese, like modernist style that combined, modern like Bauhaus style with Japanese traditional style. And the inside of the building, 3-story building, was decorated, like filled with Sofu's artwork and actually works that he collected. So he was a collector as well, and collected a lot of modern, pretty prominent Western modern artists' work. So it was really kind of decorated to show off his style and his kind of wealth as well. And then there's a lot of newspaper articles from the time covering the kind of the splendidness of this art center and the art school. So you can also kind of see why many people may have been wanting to be associated with such an institution at the time. Yeah, okay, I think that kind of gives a brief summary of the architecture.
Another question for Alice and Vera. Moving from points raised in Sooyoung's paper about the range of soft power, sorry, I will read that sentence again. Moving from points raised in Sooyoung's paper about the range of soft power cultural institutions in Seoul, could Alice and Vera talk a little bit about the presence of such centers in Japan and Cambodia?
Yeah, I don't know much about examples of other centers in Japan at the time, other than, there was like during the occupation period, the information center, American Information Center that was located in Tokyo actually served as a place that a lot of previously kind of prohibited literature and art came through. So this was like late 1940s. But actually in the late 50s and the 60s, when the Sogetsu Art Center existed, I think the art center did serve a place like that. It very much, Ikebana and Sofu's Ikebana very much align with kind of the government's project to promote Japan that was distinct from kind of wartime fascist Japan, that, and promote this image of Japan as peaceful and traditional, and Ikebana very much represented that. And Sofu's, the way he talked about his Ikebana was, Ikebana is for everyone, it's peaceful, and he used the word peace a lot. So it definitely aligned with the government's kind of image of creating kind of a new Japan to promote abroad. And then the Avant-Garde Art Center, being under this is what caused the tension, because the artists were challenging this very kind of image that Japan was trying to create as a peaceful, democratic nation in the 60s. And the avant-garde artists felt, that there's actually, that was very much a lie, and was trying to creating works to try to expose that. And it's very interesting that this was happening within the very center that was promoting the image that the artists were challenging. And then this kind of goes into, like I mentioned briefly in my presentation, aligns with the 60s student movement, and onwards.
Okay, so thank you all of you. I'm aware of time. And so we are now moving into the second half of the panel, and then we will have the presentation by Professor Tsewang Tashi, and following that, a conversation with Professor Clare Harris, which they will focus on the 3 case studies of alternative art pedagogies in Tibet since the 1980s. So now let me officially introduce our guest speakers. Professor Tsewang Tashi, currently based in Lhasa, and he is an artist, curator, and professor at the School of Fine Arts of Tibet University. He studied fine arts at the Minzu University of China, Congyang Xie, from 1980 to 84, and completed a PhD from the Norwegian University of Science and Technology in 2014. He has researched extensively on the history of modern and contemporary Tibetan art, specifically on the development of art education in Tibet in the 20th century. In 2018, he published A History of Art in 20th Century Tibet, 20世纪西藏美术史, which is only published in Chinese. And as an artist, Tsewang Tashi's works have been exhibited internationally, and he is also the co-founder of the Ganden Chunpei Artists Guild, which we will hear from him more about this art collective in his presentation today. And Professor Clare Harris is a professor of visual anthropology at the School of Anthropology and Museum Ethnography of the University of Oxford. And she is also a curator for the Asian collections at the Pitt Rivers Museum. Her doctoral thesis was published as In the Image of Tibet in 1999, which is a pioneering work on modernist and contemporary Tibetan art. Her later books, such as The Museum on the Roof of the World, published in 2012, and Photography and Tibet, published in 2016, break new ground with their interrogation of the modes in which Tibet has been represented museologically, visually, and politically, both by outsiders and Tibetans themselves. And so we will now watch a video recording of the presentation by Professor Tsewang Tashi. Because in order to avoid the technical difficulties in securing a stable Zoom connection, Professor Tsewang Tashi has very generously made time during his very busy work trip to pre-record his presentation. And thank you very much again for this, Professor Tsewang Tashi. And Leah, please share the video for us.
Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for inviting the Art School of Asia and to deliver these lectures. And I'm Tsewang Tashi from Tibet Universities. My today's talking title is Alternative Art Pedagogy in Tibet and PRC since the 1980s. In 1976, the Cultural Revolution officially ended. later, all the art schools across the country restored and the national college entrance examination systems. And meanwhile, non-governmental art pedagogy started to emerge in Tibet. Generally speaking, there's two different major art educations. One is the state art educations. For example, like art department, Tibetan Teachers College, the predecessor of the Tibetan universities, Beijing, and also Shanghai and Tianjin. There's some other art academy recruiting the art students. And second, the art educations is called the alternative art educations, in which including traditions and modern or contemporary art. Today, I'm going to talk three cases as examples. The first one is called the first amateur fine art training classes in Lhasa, Tibet. It is called Amdo Chamba's Art Schools in 1998. And the last one is Genduchumbi Artist Guilds since 2003. The first amateur fine art training classes in Lhasa, Tibet. The amateur fine art training class was established by the artist called Pei Zhuangxin in Lhasa in 1982. After he graduation from the Sichuan Academy Fine Art, he was assigned to work in the Tibet exhibition halls. Pei says the chairman of the art associations, Zhu Youtao, the Secretary General, Chen Zeming, strongly support not only did he did the promise to give them some painting materials, for example, like papers, colors, and some others materials, but also in the name of the Artist Association, he published an administration's advertisement in Tibetan and Chinese in the Tibetan Daily. At the time, the training class aims to popularize the basic education of art in our district, and it is completely free. This scene also touched other professional artists in Lhasa, such as Tsewang Dorji, he's a young Tibetan artist, and then Abu, a Tibetan Muslim artist, and then Ye Xingsheng, he was born in Sichuan, but he grew up in Lhasa, and at that time he worked also as an artist. They soon joined the teaching work of the art training class. The art training classes is completely free, and the pay and other teachers are fully voluntary. As you see these photos, this is just started after this amateur art courses. The teachers took the students to outside of the classroom. So just behind the Botala Palace, there's called Lukang Park. The students in the field, and the listening teacher, they talking about some about the art, how to drawing the natural landscapes and the sceneries, how to use the colors, so on. And this is also is a part of the school training scenes. You can see it in the central figure holding papers. He showed the students to how to draw in the sketches and from the natures. And beside, there's two small young boys. They both will come from Shigatse later. Also, they recruit to the Tibet University. These amateur training courses has had 3 months programs. The one is that the first 2 months they do the still lifes, just sitting in classrooms, painting from the still lifes. just making still life drawings. And then second ones in the third month, then took the students to outside the classroom to paint from the natures. Sometimes the teacher also says that at that time he found catalogs of the French, they called realistic painting exhibitions from French. It took place in late 1970s in Beijing. And then these works generally coming from the Barbizon schools from France. And then he took these catalogs to the classrooms, and he to introduce the students because at that time in Lhasa, also in Tibet as a whole, this accessing to this kind of foreign art information was very limited. So this is for students also gets a real opportunity to access to the foreign arts, or what is they see, what has happened, and but even though it's very limited in terms of the style, in terms of the time span. This is photos coming from at that time. The students, some landscape color paintings just behind the Potala Palace. They called it Lukang as a small park. And then after the 3 months, they finished the courses, and then students and teachers, they took group photos just in front of the Potala Palace. According to teacher Pei says that the whole students, they had about 80 students. Also, they're coming from a quite different background. For example, some coming from even the further, far away from Shikatsis, and then Loka, and also their profession is quite different. Some also from the militaries, army soldiers, and some the maybe are from factories. Also, some of them also from high schools or middle school students, and then also some also not attending the schools, but they didn't have kind of have the study chance because of different reasons. But they were very much to learn art, and this is for them quite a very rare opportunities. And the teacher Pei says the 3-month art training classes has completely changed their lives of the group of the young peoples. In 1985, Tibet universities start to recruit art candidates. At that time, more than 20 students from the training classes applied for the art department. According of the total number of the applicants, the top 2 students in the professional courses exams were from the training classes. And then another example is the Amdo-Chamba's art schools. Amdo-Chamba is considered as one of the most important early Tibetan modern artists in the 20th century. He encountered traditional art, socialist realistic art, and modern art. His life story and the art productions indicated the complex as well as the dynamic nature of the Tibetan art development in modern history. So this photo is Amdo-Chamba. He was born in 1916 and then died in 2002. On September 1999, at the age of 84, Amdo-Chamba opened his Amdo-Chamba Art School in Lhasa, just a photo of the Potala Palace. He borrowed a big apartment from the cultural relics It was formerly also belonged to the Tibetan local government's military kind of headquarters. But later, Amducham, because after the revelations, these houses completely is empty. So Amduchambas got the house, and then he recruited about 30 students to join his courses. So Amduchamba's courses also is quite his own kind of characteristic. For example, his teaching method is a kind of combining his own realistic styles and with traditional Tibetan Tanga traditions. So every week there's using 3 days to learning the Amduchamba's kind of realistic style paintings. And then another 3 days, he also invited young Tanga painters to teach Tangas to the students. All of these students, they didn't have kind of any chance to go to the kind of state-run art schools. So, but they are also very interested to learning the arts. So these students, some of these students later, when they graduated, are still running the Amduchamba's art schools. And because Amduchambas after opened his art schools in 1988, and then not so long, 2002, he died. So after he died, then there's some students still running the Amduchamba's art school until now. And then a third example is the Gendutran-based Arts Guild. This art gives members actually coming from all different background. For example, myself also is a part of these members. I'm teaching at Tibet University. Then there's another three teachers also coming from Tibet University, and then some coming from the Tibetan dancing trips. And then also some middle school students, and also there's some that times we called kind of amateur artists, young Tibetans who didn't have the chance to go to the state-run art college. So this is one of the examples. They called his name called Tsewang. Tsewang actually. He at the beginning he learned with me, so I taught him the sketches and colors and some basic knowledge of the paintings. But then later also he developed further, and I called this kind of learning process is called learning by doings. Beside teachers teaching a kind of basic knowledge of the paintings, then the artists themselves also doing and experimenting different styles and kind of different concept, and then learning by doing. And this group, not only Tsewang, and also there's some, this is Tsewang's works, and then they're also called Lu Zongde. Lu Zongde, actually his parents is Han Chinese from Sichuan, but their parents they were working in Tibet, and he was born in Lhasa, but he also speaks fluently Tibetans. And then he learned the art also with some teachers, but not in schools, but privately. He started. Then he self developed further. After joining the Gendutran art skills, I think he also got more kind of inspiration to develop, explore further, to develop his own kind of styles. This is from his Lu Zongde's one of the works. then the Congyang Art Guilds actually it is not kind of an educational institute, but it is more like as we mentioned that it's a guild, and then these artists joining together and then arranging exhibitions, sometimes also some exchanging programs. For example, inviting some artists from abroad, also from mainland China to give talks. Sometimes also some outside artists also to invite to our gallery to showing their works. So this is also is a kind of platform for younger artists to exchange ideas and then learning from different artists and get some inspirations. For example, these photos took in 2003 is our galleries, the Congyang Art Gallery, arranged the first women art exhibitions in Lhasa in 2003.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but we are at 15 minutes. We got 5 minutes left. Thanks. Okay. And in conclusions, the alternative art pedagogies emerged since the 1980s in Lhasa, and then first art training courses existed just a few months. But Amdo-Chamber's art school has existed till now. And then Congyang Art Guild is not only the doing art project, but also is a platform for growing and developing for younger artists. The comparing to the state art pedagogies, these alternative art pedagogies are much more flexible in terms of the content of the course, teaching method, and teachers often teach what they think is important, rather than follow any strict rules. Sometimes they also facing different challenges, such as there was no stable and strong financial support. So this is my today's talks. Thank you very much. Thank you again, Professor Tsewang Tashi, for the pre-recordings. And now we will hand things to Professor Clare Harris, which will have a conversation with Tsewang Tashi.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Tsewang La. And I just wanted to say thank you to the organisers of this symposium for acknowledging the art world of Tibet. And for including this discussion in this session, but also Tsewang La has been the pioneer in the study of this subject, particularly of art education in Tibet. Plus, of course, he is an artist himself, so he is absolutely, and an art teacher. So he's perfectly positioned to illuminate some really important points, as he's just done in his presentation about what has been going on in the art world in somewhere like Lhasa. And it is really mainly Lhasa since the late 70s, early 80s. I mean, I think what Tsewang has been telling us, by the way, is really important, because most people don't know anything about this apart from some of the artists themselves and in a small sort of circle in Lhasa. So Tsewang's work and his publications are really pioneering and valuable for all of us. The other thing that I thought that came out very strongly in that, which I think is important to say at this point, is that whether we're talking about the 1980s or right up until very much more recently, with Tsewang's reference to the Genchope Guild, is that those who make Tibetan art are actually a diverse group of people, and they're not just Tibetans. So it's one of the things that's fascinated me about this in my own writing about, you know, what do we mean when we talk about Tibetan art? Is Tibetan art defined by ethnicity? Well, apparently not. Is it defined by the place? I mean, you saw some paintings by Han Chinese artists that are of places in Tibet, so that could be another way of defining it. There are a number of other things that we might think about that might define what Tibetan art might be, but I won't elaborate on those now, because our focus, of course, today is on art schools and art education, and how people become the makers of something that might be kind of commodified or labelled as Tibetan art. But I just want to draw that important point about the kind of diversity of the art world, going right back to the 70s and 80s. You heard about, the kind of, Chinese artists who are kind of leading the developments of a kind of realism in the art schools that Tsewang mentioned. But if I may then, Tsewang, can I ask you a question that might be behind, other people may be thinking this, and also going back in a way to our discussion about Vera's presentation and the whole question about Buddhist art, which is another one that's a tricky one to define. But you mentioned that Amdo Chamba, the great Amdo Chamba, had done some classes in tanka painting. So I'm just thinking if you can, alongside these other modes of learning, the kind of the art school training, then the university as a space for creating, for people to learn about art, and then the Genchope Guild later on as another kind of collective formulation for as an art space. Where does tanka painting, the traditional mode of making Buddhist sort of sacred objects, otherwise known as artworks, where does that fit into this story? Are there points where that tanka painting tradition is suppressed, and others where it starts to flourish? And I wondered if you might also comment on the degree to which, tanka painters have continued to be teaching and teaching others and making traditional tankas of Buddhist subjects, and how that then plays into the more avant-garde practices of some of the artists that you work with within your Genchope Guild.
Yeah. Yes, thank you, Clare Harris, for your comment and very important questions. I think that when we're talking about traditional art in Tibet, especially tanka paintings, the tanka painter, I also interviewed some masters. They're talking about how to develop the tanka paintings for further, so making to fit to the kind of a new development, to kind of creating kind of new tanka paintings. But and they have a kind of very common idea about how to develop the traditional tanka paintings. This says, if they're producing such as kind of religious figures, for example, goddess or some Buddhas or some protectors, they shouldn't change at all in terms of the style or in terms of the representations, because tankas, first of all, actually, it's not as about art. It is kind of a medium for the meditation, for the transmitting the kind of religious ideas through this kind of art object. So the most important is first is to keeping kind of this kind of originalities, a kind of formal kind of this kind of images. In order to keep this kind of religious functions as mediums. But if you do this to do some new tankas, maybe you can change some other part of the works. For example, if you paint a lama, is a figure, it's a human figure, like a Panchen Lama or some other figures, you can paint him as you wish to present. But still, there's some kind of framework. You cannot change, just like Picasso's, to change the nose, put it in there. But this is still, this is for the first of all, it is religious functions. It should be kept very priorities. So therefore, tanka teaching, tanka art teachings, mainly you cannot carry it in the kind of state-run art college or art institutes, because there's some things a very strict rule you should follow it. So that is also we have now facing challenges at the university. So then we're recruiting some master degree students. So also they're doing research, and same time they should do some, they should making some new tankas. But then
It is, but under their traditional master's teaching, these students actually cannot do much to change this in terms of the artistic styles. So that is quite. There's some tensions between this kind of art creating and contemporary modern art and traditional art. So, but for example, like Gindu Chumbi you just mentioned, Gindu Chumbi is in these groups. We also have some Tanka painters, but sometimes they also creating kind of quite new, different Tanka paintings. But quite often sometimes there's a quite strong reactions from the audience, some viewers. They said, this is not Tanka, you cannot put this, you cannot put that. So for them also, this is one kind of a social comment, but same time, this Tibet as a whole, there's some big popularities to believing in Buddhism. So this is a big market for the artists. Many artists they living by doing tankas. So they should. It's the market. It's for them is very important. So if you don't follow the traditions, you will lose the market. So it is quite challenging for them. So Amdo Chamba students also facing these challenges. Amdo Chamba, because he wants to do something quite little bit further to change something's tradition. Yes, this is kind of
he was, as we saw in that slide you showed of him in his studio, which is an amazing picture. Where there he is. He's the great pioneer. As I said earlier, he's painting for important commissions, like for the Nobu Linker, a building that belongs to the Dalai Lama, and then he's also painting all those things. You could see extracts from some of his paintings on the wall, couldn't you? And he's also got a kind of realist Buddha image in that photograph, so which is definitely deviating from the Tanka painting tradition. So he was a revolutionary in a kind of modest way, well, no, more than a modest way at that particular point. But I think that you've hit upon exactly one of the, the really complicated things about the Tibetan situation, which is that you've got this, this strong demand, as you say, from the customers who are of Tanka paintings. Are believers. They cannot allow for a certain amount of too much deviation from the iconometric specifications, and so a Tanka painter still has to learn all those rules, right, in order to produce something that is right for the consumer, and that can be religiously sanctified with rapne and all these things, these ceremonies, and yet on the other hand you've got a kind of demand for maybe some change, and some artists themselves, well, we know at one end of the spectrum very definitely deviating from that traditional kind of iconography and iconometry. So when you said, of course, Tanka painters, of course, definitely not supposed to kind of be inspired by Picasso or Braque or something, but that moment in the 80s when you were studying at the Minsu University, and when other Tibetan artists were starting to kind of to learn through exposure to exhibitions in Beijing and in books and so on, which has come up a lot today. Publications, catalogues coming through. There was, as far as I recall, in the 80s, some people who did dare to sort of break apart the body of the Buddha in these kind of modernist-inspired renditions of the Buddha body, and I just wondered if you want to say something about, because you've brought out really strongly that there were these, these various alternative spaces in a way, not only for the studying of art, but also for the kind of viewing of art and the critical conversations about art. And in the 80s, were there not these the sweet tea houses? The tea houses are places where small exhibitions went on by artists who were presumably not in any kind of mainstream studying situation, but we're using those other spaces again to show their art and show this kind of more radical work.
Yes. That's you are very true. That's actually already you are very to elaborate it in your book, Image of Tibet. So that's true. But also you see that in the street tea houses, the several artists also never been to the art academy. So they also join this kind of group to show their works in this kind of space. So we can see this kind of just as just other today's you mentioned that this is kind of for the just like a Japanese example. You know, this, the women that they didn't have the chance to go to academy, so they just join in this kind of to program. So it is in Tibet also not only the women, but the mainly is the men artists doing the art, but But many of them, they didn't get any chance to go to the academy for various reasons. So these kind of space also creating kind of their new opportunity to develop further and learning, exchanging ideas. And also it's kind of a more autonomous kind of space to further explore much more freely rather than state-run kind of exhibitions or spaces.
Mm-hmm. Well, that was the other thing I wanted to ask you. By the way, Sooyoung will have to interrupt us because we probably won't notice the time. So just tell us when to stop this conversation. Yeah, one of the other questions that I thought that you would be ideally placed to answer is about that relationship then between the official kind of places of art learning, which particularly became Tibet University's art department, where you have worked for many years, mm-hmm. And then these what you're describing as alternative spaces, including, you know, the kind of spaces that Gedenshepe Guild created, literally an actual physical building, like you showed us in your slide that on the parkour, which I've visited myself. So I'm just wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about well, maybe even from your own personal experience. With one hat on, you are teaching within Tibet University and imparting the different styles of painting that I think are taught in that department. And it might be interesting for people to know what different styles, literally, of art are taught in that department, from Thangka through to Western styles, really. And then the other thing is, you know, then when you're a member of the collective, which is the Gedenshepe Guild, and that's it seems to me, trying to create a different kind of more open, you know, maybe, you know, space for people who have not got art school training to be able to at least exhibit their work and at least have a space to discuss it. Because one of the things many artists have told me who live in Lhasa or who were trained in Lhasa is that one of the things they felt they lacked was kind of any of those like journals or, you know, a kind of critical kind of community in a way to kind of talk about art. So it seemed to me that the Gedenshepe Guild created that kind of space for that, as amongst other things that you were trying to do. So could you tell us a bit more about the relationship between being a Tibet University official art teacher and then operating in these other spaces?
Yes, generally speaking, stay in a state-run art institutions such Tibet universities, then we are very much in kind of following this kind of state kind of framework for the art educations, very much based on the kind of general kind of state art education systems. But at the same time, Tibet University also the art education institutions, the content of the method and also what they're teaching also very much that has changed since the 1980s. At the beginnings, you know, Tibet universities, the teachers, many of teachers coming from Shanghai, mainland China, Shanghai, and then Tianjin, these kind of, they called education aid programs. So teachers they were coming from there. But these teachers, mainly they were very much educated in 1950s, early 60s. They followed kind of state education forum like Xu Beihong's and this kind, also Soviet this kind of styles, very much based on this. But later, late 1980s and early 90s, there are many younger teachers, students graduated from the mainland China, from Beijing, Shanghai, others, both Tibetan and Chinese, and then come to Tibet to work in these institutions, also in education centers. But their ideas are totally different compared to other previous teachers. There is very much, sometimes even they're very much evolving kind of very into the kind of modernist styles, using the ink papers to doing completely abstract work. Also, they're doing some kind of experimental kind of looks like action paintings or something like performance in art. It's all kind of some doings. You know that 1980s actually is the atmosphere is quite much more relaxed than other times. So it is quite changing, but still, as the government run the state education center, they have a strict rules. And then besides what they should teach, and also not only the teaching the art, also teaching theory, history, all this kind of, there are some very strict rules. So also they quite often they're evaluating by the state to the teaching content and method. So there are some quite strict. But the Genduchampi space is a kind of much more relaxing. And we don't have any kind of rules there, but they should be creative and to do something works. Then which is encouraging art, also inspiring each others, and then also exchanging some kind of informations and new ideas, and then also sort of inviting, also visiting to the Beijing, also aboard. We also been to London, also United States, as a kind of exchange programs, also resident artists in resident. So there's some many new information. So through this kind of activities we're getting. So this is creating kind of a more flexible and more open space for us. Yes, this is a quite different compared to the state-run education program.
It's brilliant. It's brilliant. The Genduchampi Guild is an excellent organisation and founded in 2002. 2003. So you've got 20 years to celebrate very soon.
Yeah. yes.
Retrospective, an exhibition of 20 years. Yeah. Now I don't know how we're doing for time. Sooyoung, should we speak a little bit longer, or should we open up for other questions? For other
I
people
think it's okay to keep it discussion more like open-ended, and like other panelists could just jump in for questions. Yeah,
I think that would be great. Yes, thank you.
Yeah,
thank you, Tsewang.
Yes.
So if anyone else has got some questions for you.
Maybe you could just continue, and then if we have questions, then we can jump in.
Okay, right. Well, obviously we sort of like we came to a very nice high point there of the great successes of the Genduchampi Guild. What do you think about the point I just made earlier, Tsewang, which is sort of related to the theme of this conference today, which is about, I mean, in several of the other presentations, there was a lot of discussion about, publications, catalogues, books that came in from other parts of the world, from France and from America, whatever it is, about cultural centres, about other things that you might call maybe the kind of infrastructure or the kind of the print culture of the art world. How does that play out, for you and your fellow artists in Lhasa? I mean, as I said, several people have said to me over the years, artists who I've interviewed from Lhasa, that, and maybe this is out of date, my information, but, that at least 10 years ago, people were definitely saying there isn't enough of a kind of audience for our work, plus a kind of critical environment for it. We don't have a kind of journal of equivalents to many of the journals that are published in Beijing, for example, that really kind of gives, and we don't have enough writers in Tibetan, for example, who can write about, our work and give us this kind of feedback as part of our, constantly kind of developing our work. Is that still true, or are there other ways in which,
Yes, I give you one example. You mentioned this kind of publications or printings. Now, especially this internet is quite developed. So so now what happening in Tibet is that we often have a quite different kind of art project, exhibitions and other like lectures, other things. So in this program, often this online programs now acting quite very active roles, and also very much active than the previous years to public catalogs. It's take times. Also financially, sometimes expensive. So now it's using in China, I say, you know, that the WeChat using is quite very popular. And then using also there's some online kind of directly to publicize the event. For example, last year we had solo exhibitions for sitting drama, women artists sitting drama. This is the first what we considered in Tibet. It's the first women art exhibitions in Tibet. And then same time we using the different programs to publicize all the event, and also we had kind of discussions with the artists and the different curators. These exhibitions are run by maybe you heard about it, it's Gesanyala. She's also young girls, just graduated from the Columbia University. She started, she's working as a curator now. So she organized these exhibitions last year, and then publicized on the internet. And then from the last year, she also launched another festival called Tea House Art Festival. Yes. Yeah. In this art festival, actually, not only the painters and sculptors involved, also some calligraphers, and then also performers, the music performers, and then inviting the different performers. Also, same time in Shete is formerly it was a monastery in Lhasa, so belonged to Reti Monastery, but Shete just in front of the Kichu Hotel, and now restored the Shete Monastery. But the monasteries now there's no any religious items in there. It's kind of empty space, and then there's a big courtyard. But some residents still living in this courtyard. So these are main art activities that took place in this courtyard. And then at night, the screening on big open space screening. As we did in Cultural Revolution, we see the open space to see the films. So they showed some films to the local people. And at night in this monastery, they played jamye, guitar, Tibetan traditional guitar. The guitar players from the one teacher, he's just graduated from Tibet University. And then his village's children, now they're learning in Lhasa. They performed in this monastery. And then many audience coming from this courtyard, all kinds of old men, old ladies, and different working background. They enjoyed it very much. I was also there. And very much touched by this kind of scenes. It's a very dynamic atmosphere. It's good. So this year, she will run a second Tea House Art Festival this year. I think quite soon will be take place in Lhasa.
Great, that's great. Well, I hope I can come and visit. That sounds wonderful. Yeah. And I remember Tsewang was in a very bad way last time I was there, so it's been transformed into this art space, and I think it's really great that you're also highlighting the this younger generation who are coming through, who acting as curators and so on. And I just want to mention, of course, my backdrop, which is the Pit Rivers Museum where I work, which is this is a picture from 2019 when we did an exhibition with another very talented young woman from Lhasa, Nima Droma, who's a photographer, artist, curator, and she also curates events, I think, and festivals in Lhasa. So it's really good to know that, I mean, she, by the way, also was educated, she did her first degree in Britain. So there's another interesting question going back to the theme of today's symposium about the education of these young people. Some of them, it seems, are now having the opportunity to go and study in America or in Britain, other parts of Europe, and obviously, you know, going to Beijing and Shanghai, as people have always done, to kind of get those cutting edge kind of training. So anyway, so yeah, I'm really excited that this younger generation are kind of coming through and doing all these wonderful things. Those are my main questions. I mean, I think, you know, Tsewang and I could probably talk for ages about the art, which I need to be brought up to speed with, which Tsewang has been doing so well. But is there anybody else coming through who'd like to put a question or to either of us, I suppose?
Yes, thank you, Professor Clare Harris. Actually, I have prepared some questions for Professor Tsewang Tashi, but actually his answer is already, he has already answered in answering what you asked and commented. I just have a more specific and smaller question for Professor Tsewang Tashi. And when you founded the Gundam Shunpei Art School in 2003, were you looking at any other collectives as your model when founding this collective? And why do you use the term artist guild instead of some kind of collective or art group?
Artist guild is as you know, in Chinese, there are terms they call it 抱团取暖. It's 抱团取暖. It's kind of to come together to help each others.
Yeah.
How to translate? Yes.
Come together and hug together and get warm.
Yes, yes. That means because you know, in Lhasa at that time, there's no any space for the contemporary art. There's I think only as small museums there, but generally showing there's the kind of traditional collectings. But there's no any modern contemporary art gallery or space there. So we want to come to join these artists together to do something to open a space for the outside world. So which also they put in these galleries in Bako. It's kind of a cultural center and old city centers. So there's a lot of the shops they're selling traditional Tanka paintings, sculptures, and then other items like a traditional clothing and jewelry there. So, but there's no any kind of signs of the, you can see kind of new development in there. So we want just to open a small space, and then one thing that to show what is happening here. And then another is also to helping each other to kind of to develop the contemporary works to further. It's not only the showing, but at the same time we also to do together something supporting together, because the number of the artists actually is very limited. Very few artists in Lhasa, but same time there's some, just Claire mentioned, we also have some artists from the mainland China, so some from Sichuan, and then some from Shanxi. They're working as a kind of independent artist in Lhasa. There's called Zhang Piao ba. We called in Bei Piao. Just these artists just they're living and working in different cities like Beijing, Shanghai, but and also Lhasa. There's but not many, but there are few artists, photographers, and also working in Lhasa. We know each other, and then we join together. But because of this kind of activities and the programs, so later we got many chances to show to the different places, and for example, like Beijing. In Beijing, to 1990s, we show 2009 in Songzhuang Fine Art Museum. We go to the first contemporary Tibetan the art from Tibet. Contemporary exhibitions, big exhibitions, and then also some Europe and America. So there's many things happened since we established the Artist Guild.
Thank you. And I actually have more questions, but I think we could discuss later after the symposium. And maybe I could ask Sooyoung, Vera, or Alice, would you have questions for Professor Tsewang, Tashi, or Clare Harris?
I have a question for Professor Tashi. I think it touches back on the discussion that Professor Harris and Professor Tashi were having about this the official or state-sponsored school versus alternative. And my question is about finance of these spaces, because, you know, from kind of the research I've been doing, a lot of the times, even if it's not directly state-sponsored, when you follow individual people, you often find threads. I'm not suggesting that this is happening to any of the case studies you're looking at, but I'm just saying, look, kind of tracing, considering the financial backing of these institutions kind of often, I think, is helpful in understanding the ideals that might have been operating within these alternative schools. And Professor Tashi, you mentioned about how the first case you talked about, the amateur fine art training class in Lhasa, how that was completely free. So I'm wondering how that was possible, and yeah, how the financing worked.
Yes, at the 1980s, you know, just finished the Cultural Revolutions. So this, economically, this is a kind of that state as a whole did not completely become a kind of market economic kind of this market. It is a kind of still everything's run by states. You know, they're not much kind of private business. Many, for example, exhibition houses and all the resources like painting materials, colors, papers, art associations. They have everything there. So resources there. So when the Pei established kind of amateur art trainings, he got kind of official papers to borrow a house from the cultural cultural palace, just from the palace. But he cannot go there and say, I want to establish training courses. But he need to write applications to the art association. But then art association, after heard he want to do this program, so they're very much supporting, actually. Supporting. Then they gave official papers to the cultural palace to let the Pei borrow the houses. And same time, they also said you need some support. And then they gave some painting materials, such like a pen, canvas, not canvas, as a papers, what colors, some pencils or some other, but very simple, as a very limited. But still, he got this kind of material supplies from the art association. But then the houses he borrowed from the cultural palace, because all these kind of the running by state. So, but now if you do this kind of program, it's very difficult. If you go there, so that you should buy, you should pay. But at that times is you know, and also I couldn't mention that Pei opened the first art galleries in Lhasa after this training program in Lhasa, commercial gallery. But before that, the artists didn't know any ideas kind of this art can sell the art. Even myself, I was a student there. I didn't have any ideas about how selling my works. Didn't know any ideas. So the artists didn't know any ideas. But after the kind of open door policies and then the economic systems, you know, this the lunch started by the government. So then artists suddenly found this. There's a kind of economic values to their works. This is the kind of turning point, 1980s in Lhasa.
Thank you. So we're already running late of time, and so as Thank you very much for all the panelists today, especially Professor Tsewang, Tashi, and Clare Harris, and also Alice, Clara, and Sooyoung. And so the last reminder is that our next session is scheduled tomorrow at 8 p.m. Hong Kong time, which will be focusing on the printmaking and pedagogy. So that's all for today's symposium. Yeah, thank you very much for all of you and for the audience.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.